Hello, today's Bible study comes from Second Corinthians, the 11th chapter, the 5th through the 11th verse, and reads as follows. I do not think that I am in the least inferior to those super apostles. I may indeed be untrained as a speaker, but I do have knowledge. We have made this perfectly clear to you in every way. Was it a sin for me to lower myself in order to elevate you by preaching the gospel of God to you free of charge? I robbed other churches by receiving support from them so as to serve you. And when I was with you and needed something, I was not a burden to anyone. For the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied what I needed. I have kept myself from being a burden to you in any way, and you will continue to do so, as surely as the truth of Christ is in me. Nobody in the regions of Achaia will stop this boasting of mine. Why? Because I do not love you. God knows I do. Wow. Mm. Well, as you can see, Paul is sitting here and he's speaking in regards to humility. And he says, For I consider that I am not at all inferior to the most eminent apostle. And Paul is comparing himself to um, some of the eminent apostles here. And these were the apostles that the Corinthians they preferred over Paul. Not that Paul had done anything wrong, but they preferred their look, their status over Paul. Um, and it doesn't tell us which ones they were, but there were other ones that they preferred. And Paul acknowledges that. But he's speaking in a sarcastic tone. Um, and and he definitely is speaking sarcastically when he speaks to their so-called false teachers, apostles, who thought and they claim that we're better than Paul. Um, so he says, I'm not at all inferior. And he's talking about whoever these apostles are. Doesn't make a difference. Paul was not less than them, and he did not claim to be less than them. See, Paul explains things about this later on, but right now he just said, "Hey, I'm not less than any of them." And then he starts talking, and he says, "Even though, excuse me, I am untrained in speech." And this is just for the people of Corinth, or a lot of the times the Greeks here. Uh, Paul was untrained in speech, as he says here, even though I am untrained in speech. Um, they were looking for this perfectly pronunciated, grammatically perfect person with a high level conversation. And this was more entertaining to them because then they felt that Paul was on their level and that the speaker was on their level. And they wanted someone who could speak like that. But Paul said, I'm not, and I don't want you to get this confused. Paul was able to speak in that manner, but I think Paul was unwilling to preach that way. I think Paul was saying, hey, I'm going to preach how the word is given to me. And Paul was not trying to meet man's standards. Paul was trying to make this word known, well known, and received. And it wasn't the polished part or the entertaining part that he was worried about. He was concerned about preaching the gospel, plain and simple. And this was one of the big differences between Paul and these eminent apostles. Um, Paul didn't have that shine, that spit and polish that they were looking for, but they had already saw that in his character and his appearance and all that. So the Corinthians just are nitpicking at Paul. And he says, but we have been thoroughly manifested among you in all things. Paul said, I'm not doing it that way. But he did give of himself a lot. He did it in all things that he did. Paul wasn't this Paulish speaker that they want him to be. But you could understand him with no problem. And he was honest. He preached the gospel. He spoke the truth. And it was all given to him. And he says to him, did I commit sin in humbling myself? Why? Because I preached the gospel of God to you free of charge. See, there was another problem here because Paul didn't take money. And they thought that if you were that great of a speaker and all that, that you should take money for speaking. And if you didn't, they were disregarding him as not doing a good job or just being a good public speaker. And this is even knocking his teaching when he spoke because he didn't take money. But remember, Paul told you he wasn't going to be a stumbling block for him. And Paul wasn't worried about what they thought of him. Because preaching that came from Paul. That was in him. The gospel was being preached. And Paul had told him earlier, if you remember a few chapters back, he says, if me being paid or being taken care of like the other apostles makes it a stumbling block for you, then don't let me be a stumbling block for anybody. That's how Paul was. He says, did I commit a sin? And the problem was they didn't like Paul. They were bad with Paul. And it was because they were pretty worldly, big-time people in their minds. And they thought Paul might be a sin because of how he preached the gospel to them free of charge. And Paul there is an irony here. I mean, you're getting the word, you're getting the true word, you're getting good word, and you're getting it for free, but you don't think it's any good because you haven't had to pay for it. And Paul says, I robbed other churches, taking wages from them to minister to you. And, he says robbed here, but he is really saying, I took from somewhere else to help you out. I received my support from Christians over here, okay? While I've been here with you. And could he say he robbed them? Yeah, he could say it because those churches were the ones paying him and he wasn't doing any work there, but they were taking care of Paul. And the truth of the matter is the Corinthians should have been supporting him when he ministered to them, when he was talking to them about the Lord. But to them, Paul was not who they expected or not who they wanted. But Paul was not the problem. Paul didn't take, Paul didn't beg, he didn't do any of those things. Paul said he worked with his hands. Paul didn't bother any of them in that manner. So he goes on and says, for what I lacked, the brethren who came from Macedonia supplied. You remember we talked about the Church of Macedonia. They didn't have much. Well, he says it right here. For what I lacked, the brethren who came from Macedonia supplied. Once again, the other churches are being robbed, and Paul says, the other church is the one who supplied my needs. And remember the church of Philippi was here in this area? And Paul understood their generosity even with Macedonia being a poor church. He thanked them. So then he goes and he keeps talking to him and he says, as the truth of Christ is in me, No one shall stop me from boasting in this region of Achaia. Paul could boast that he didn't take anything from anybody and that he was truly interested in getting their souls right, getting their education about the Lord right, getting the message out and helping them out. That's what he was interested in. And he's telling them that, hey, no one shall stop me from this boasting because I ain't done any of that. The best thing I've done for you is given it to you free and told you about God. And then it goes, why? Ooh, and he hits him right here. Why? Because I do not love you. God knows I do. And when he says this, Paul's boasting, and it's not in a strong area, a strong place right now. And his image was unimpressive to them, and they were embarrassed by him. So why did he embarrass them in this manner, you think? Or why were they embarrassed by him? It was only because he loved them. Paul stayed there only because he loved them. Because I do not love you, but God knows. Paul is clowning them still in my mind, messing with them. Because he truly loved them and was trying to bring them back from thinking like the world instead of understanding the word. They were concentrating on the world, on appearance, on image, on material stuff, and they were missing the whole spiritual stuff. And Paul was trying to get their minds to change. Amen.